Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM-LP 103.3 in Asheville, North Carolina, this is The Final Straw, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcast and podcast emanating out of occupied Tsalagi land in southern Appalachia.
Hi there. Today we're excited to share a conversation with Adrienne Maree Brown, the writer of such books as Holding Change, We Will Not Cancel Us, Pleasure Activism, and Emergent Strategy. Adrienne's recent novella, Grievers, the first of a trilogy, was published in AK Press's new Black Dawn imprint of speculative fiction. In this discussion, we dig into the book, which is set in Detroit with a new illness that seems to only affect Black people. Spoiler alert. We talk also about the role of speculative fiction in liberation movements, spirituality, ritual, and grief in our organizing, and holding space for intergenerational struggle. If you like this conversation, you can find the transcript and printable zine on our website in a week at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. Support us by sharing our content in real life and through social media, send us money or buy merch to help us pay for the transcriptions, and you can put us on your local radio via the radio link on our website.
Well, I'm Adrienne Maree Brown. I'm a writer. I write speculative fiction, science fiction, and nonfiction that is about, maybe it's called transformative fiction, transformative nonfiction. Like I'm really thinking about how we transform our conditions and transform ourselves to transform the world around us. And I recently moved this year from Detroit to Durham, although I still feel my roots in Detroit, and I'm shooting new roots down into the ground here in Durham. And I'm an auntie and a Virgo and a voracious feeler.
That's really exciting to hear you're in the same state as where we're based in this podcast. I'm over here outside of Asheville right now. So welcome.
Beautiful. I keep hearing I need to go there.
Yeah,
so.
It's, it's a place. There's a lot of good people there.
It's a place.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I love that idea of transformative fiction, and I'm also thinking about like speculative fiction. I first came to your work through Octavia's Brood, which is a collection of science.
Yeah. Visionary fiction.
And like it was so exciting to see fiction by people who are like grounded in movement work, and I use the stories when I'm teaching around like liberatory science fiction. And like I feel like from that time, you and your co-editors and contributors are making the case that science fiction and liberation work go together to envisioning a new world. And then you also kind of develop that in your nonfiction by kind of like theorizing through Octavia Butler, who's a very wonderful science fiction writer. So I just want to start kind of like generally, because I know people, especially people who are like committed to changing the world, will sometimes dismiss fiction as like not important or escapist.
Yeah.
I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about like what you think stories can do, and especially stories outside of like strict realism, and how they like help us.
Yeah. I mean, I think that a lot of people throughout history who have been trying to organize and change the world have realized that ultimately what we're trying to do is change the entire narrative inside of which we live, and that the narratives inside of which we live are what allow us to either accept the oppressive conditions we're in and participate and become cogs in them, or to see ourselves in resistance to those systems, or to see ourselves as transforming and creating something beyond those systems. And, Gloria Anzaldúa said that it's like we have to dream it before we can create it. I'm paraphrasing. And I also think the work of Toni Cade Bambara and the thinking of, our work as artists is to make the revolution irresistible. Mm-hmm. That always comes into play for me here, because anyone who's organized for any period of time, we learn very quickly that if we don't have a story that people can see themselves a part of, it doesn't matter how good our data and our facts are, right? People are not going to radically change their climate behaviors, climate impacting behaviors, because we're all going to die because of what's happening to the climate. We need a story in which we fall back into right relationship with this planet and what that can look like. So I think every advance that we have made for human rights, social justice rights, economic and environmental rights, there's a story in there about how humans are changing that helps us to make that advance. And so then the work of writers becomes really important, that it's actually on us in some ways to figure out what are new stories that feel compelling for people to move towards a future that involves changing themselves. And that's one of the things I think Octavia Butler did really, really well. I think she's like the master class of that, because she did not write easy futures. She did not write utopias. But she did write worlds where we could imagine ourselves still wanting to persist and wanting to figure it out and wanting to form the kind of relationships that could persist through change. And that's, I hope that's the lineage that I'm picking up, and that there's a whole, generation of writers who grew up reading Octavia, are shaped and inspired by her and by so many other Black speculative fiction writers and Ursula Le Guin, feminist science fiction writers and other folks. So, I hope that field grows and grows. I want to see lots of people who are up to movement work also writing the stories of our future.
Yeah, I love how you're talking about that, and it made me think about people sometimes talking about how like we need on the left or whatever, like some kind of myth that is like compelling, but there's like often a feeling of danger with myth, because we've seen myth be motivated obviously for like horrific violence and fascism.
Yes.
And I'm wondering just like also like if you have thoughts about like myth making in this, and also because like myth is like a spiritualized story in a way, like has kind of ritual and practice that's often part of it. And I'm wondering if you think like spirituality is connected in this kind of like fuller vision of the world that like our movements need to kind of engage with.
Yeah. It's interesting. I feel like I've come back around to it. I feel like this past 2 years has really been kind of a shock to my system as an organizer and someone who has just deeply loved and cared about humans, and watching what this last 2 years has looked like and how far we are from a future in which we could think collectively and make decisions for the community and not just for ourselves. So I have been driven back to the spiritual realm more in this period, in the sense of, I don't think it's enough to have a great case and a great set of information and a great even set of practices or a roadmap. I think that we have to attend to the aspect of humanity that thinks of ourselves as having some kind of destiny, some kind of purpose, some kind of calling for being here, right? And I think if we don't, we cede that territory to the purpose of capitalism, the manifest destiny, right? The destiny of colonial efforts, which is we constantly grow and we accumulate more and more territory and material, and then we die. And you're just trying to win the game for while you're alive, and then you're gone, and it doesn't matter what you leave behind. And if we have a radically different purpose, which I think we do, I think our purpose is around loving each other, and I think our purpose is around finding ways to be in relationship that transcend difference, that actually create a biodiversity out of a bunch of different peoples. And so I'm like, if that's our purpose, which does feel spiritual to me, that work feels spiritual to me in the sense that it is greater than the material, right? Like it's something that happens that we can feel in the body, but we can also I feel deeply connected to ancestors who I knew while they were living, and now they are not in a body anymore. They still shape my decision making. They still tell me things that I need to do and pay attention to. I feel very connected to those who are not born yet, generations that are yet to come, who have intentions and designs for what this world could look like. And I feel deeply connected and driven by the non-human elements of this world. I feel that the water has a design, and the air has a design, and the creatures all have their purposes. And I think we're the lost ones, right? Yeah. I think the humans have lost our way inside of the greater narrative. And I think in the myth piece, the thing that comes to mind, I was recently taught this wisdom that an Ojibwe elder who has since become ancestor, Walter Brissett, shared, which is that the most European thing is to think that there's one way to do everything or anything. And when I think about that colonial impulse, then I'm like, the opposite of that is to have many, many myths and to sort of live in a world in which all of them can coexist and dance with each other. I like that. I've read some really beautiful collections of stories, of origin stories and myths that people hold for the beginning of the world. And I'm like, they're all really perfectly logical for their location and their time. And I'm like, I think we need to create myths that feel perfectly logical for our location and our time.
Yeah, I guess I kind of want to pick up on this thread, but grounding it more in Grievers, your recently published novel, which I really loved.
Thank you.
And because I think, I mean, and I guess in this discussion, I'm going to talk about what happens in the novel. So I guess I'll have to put some spoiler alerts.
Alert.
But, so the main character who we follow closely throughout, like Dune is grappling with some of this stuff, I think very specifically, especially as it comes to like grief and loss. But
yes.
Before I go more specific into that, like there is a reflection that she has on this idea of like cultural appropriation in the kind of rituals that we do, and like wondering what her place is in that, and like thinking also about the formation of Black culture and the history of cultural theft, and like kind of how she's trying to like piece things together, or sees her elders doing that, and like what's okay for her to do. And I thought that discussion in the book was just really perceptive, like and flexible, in thinking about how we at like cultures, what we do, and like and I just wonder if you want to talk a little bit about that and the kind of like the formation of culture in our present actions in relation to like the histories that we inherit.
Well, I think if you're okay with it, I want to read that paragraph that you're referencing. So in the book, Dune is a very analytical character, is someone who doesn't think of herself as spiritual at all. And she's been raised by a mother who is very spiritual and a father who was highly analytical, both of whom have now passed. And so she's creating this, what she thinks is a research project in her basement about all the death that's happening in Detroit. And her aunt comes over and she's like, it's an altar. It's a sacred space actually that you're creating. So Dune is hesitant about that because she said, we never had a clear lineage and I don't want to be, and she talks about that kind of grabbing everything all around me. She says, I don't belong to anything. It doesn't belong to me. And what Eloise, her aunt, says to her is, when everything has been taken, filling that emptiness ain't appropriation. It's something else. It ain't pure, none of it. I think of these practices, my orisha, my altars, my prayers and chants, and all this accumulation of spiritual armor as something to comfort me when my ancestral ghost limbs hurt. Because I need spirit so much, I answer what calls me. Spirit is bigger than any one lineage. It comes through all these channels. It's complicated, beautifully complicated, but it ain't appropriation, not amongst displaced and denied peoples. It's different. At minimum, it's sacred data. So, when that piece of writing was coming through, I was very uncomfortable. It felt like it was something that was coming from beyond or coming from another place that I needed to contend with and sit with. And it felt like something that also felt true as it came through. And I feel like I have sat in rooms full of displaced peoples who, through the process of colonization, have been intentionally pulled away from their indigenous stories and their indigenous landscapes and their indigenous songs and wisdom, whatever that originally was. And not only displaced, but then the multiracial and interracial pieces start to come in. Dune is an interracial character, and most of us in the U.S. at this point are interethnic, if not interracial people, no matter how we are viewed, right? There has been some straying from whatever that indigenous singular identity was. So I've been in so many spaces where people are being called by spirit into an action and then are catching themselves and stopping themselves and in a way policing themselves. Like, is this right? Is this okay? And I think that it's such a complicated piece of ground. In my own life have felt myself really drawn to spaces that had an intention to be shared. So I've been really drawn to the wisdom of Aikido. I've been really drawn to the wisdom of Buddhism. I've been really drawn into some of the wisdom and practices of yoga, things where there was an intention. There were teachers who were like, we want this to go as far as it can. We think there's something universal here that everyone can use. And I've always defaulted to the idea of, if someone in the room has this practice that they can authentically bring in, that's good news. But I do think we all need practices. And so I think that there's a big question for me right now, for everyone to be figuring out, how do I find the spiritual practices that help me line up with spirit, help me actually hear spirit? And how do I do that in a way that is what I think of as right relationship, right? Where I'm not dishonoring, stealing, or taking. And I just love this wisdom from Eloise, that it's like, if everything's been taken from you, then accumulating some practices is not a bad thing. It's actually okay. And I think a lot of us need some permission to find those ways. And then, then inside of that, to figure out, how do I do this without causing harm? What does that look like,
Yeah, I mean, I really resonate with that. As a person who's brought up Jewish and like pretty observant, and then rebelled against it because it felt like it didn't align with the way that I wanted to live in the world. And then like recently finding community with like other trans and queer anarchist Jews, I was like, oh, we can do this in a way that works for me, and like keeps some of the like rituals that I grew up with, or rethinks them really. But like, I don't have to just like, I mean, it's such a big part of me. I like don't have to like get rid of it or like.
Yeah. And it's even like a thing of releasing the shame that comes from not having those things, or from having them tied to a politic that you don't agree with. Like I grew up in a Christian household and going to Christian church services, and I still love more than almost anything to be in a group of people singing together, singing spiritual music, singing hymns, singing in harmony with each other. It moves me. I love praying with other people. I love laying hands on people when it's time to heal. All of those practices still generate in me a connection to spirit, even if I needed to move them outside of a political context that was homophobic and transphobic and racist and, hierarchical and all those things that don't align with my politic. And so I think there is something about reclaiming the practices that are around you and that you grow up with. And then I think there's also, for me and my lineage, recognizing like some place it got cut off that I need to be in a worshipful relationship with the moon. But I know that I need to be in a worshipful relationship with the moon because the moon tells me that directly. And so then I can, I can go research and try to figure out like, what are the practices for this? And what I've cobbled together is something between what I've researched and learned and what I can feel called directly to. And I think that feels really important to me, that like, as a human being on land, in relationship to the earth, in relationship to other people, there's some of this that we have to be able to feel. Mm-hmm. And we have to be able to trust that that feeling can cut through the divisiveness that colonialism implanted in our society.
Yeah. And I think the spiritual or the ancestral phantom limbs is a really perfect way of saying that. And I think it's an experience that people have who like might not even identify in those ways of like having lost something or knowing that they lose something. So yeah, I think
I mean, on the deepest level, I think that so much of our fighting with each other, so much of our power tripping with each other is because we have lost that place in us that needs to be in relationship to something much larger than ourselves. Like there's a part of us that needs that. And if you're like, but it doesn't make sense to me that it'd be one white guy on a throne.
Yeah.
If that story doesn't zhuzh out for you, then, it's like, oh, and what I feel like I've been learning slowly is that almost every people's has some part of our story that is about being tied into the land, being tied into the actual superstructure of nature, of the natural world, and that we are not outside of that, but part of it. That for me has been the way that I'm like, it doesn't matter what other things are going on in your belief system. If you can go out and get in relationship with the land you're on, you'll be heading in the right direction. And it needs to be a real authentic listening relationship, right? Because the land has borders and boundaries of her own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to get a little bit to like place, but sticking with ritual, thinking about grief, one of the really moving parts early in the book is the extended scene of Dune doing the work of kind of like burying, or not burying, I guess, like just dealing with her mother's body, cremating her. I mean, so I've been thinking about this via other texts, like how grieving itself can be like a political act, and like certain rituals can be forms of resistance. And I'm just wondering how you think, what kind of act is Dune undertaking in that moment? Is it just for her, or does it belong to the movement, like in honoring her mother and her father's, like, because they're both people who had been part of movements, right?
Yeah. So I think that this is a ritual. I have done a lot of reading around death rituals, and it's so fascinating to me how recent it is that there is this economy around death that takes the bodies away from their families, away from their home as soon as possible, and that fills them with chemicals and puts them on brief display, and then puts them inside of a box that's going to make decomposition very difficult, and then puts them in the ground somewhere. That's a very recent practice inside of the long history of humans, and a much more common practice in most places has been some variation of washing the body, some variation of sitting and honoring the body, being with the body, everyone getting to come and say goodbye, and then a process of burying the body into the dirt or burning the body, setting up a pyre, pushing it into the water. But there were so many ways. It was like, return to nature. You came from the dust, and to the dust you shall return, right? So in this story, it's an economic resistance that, Dune is like, this system did not care about my mom. It did not protect her, did not keep her alive, and they don't get to touch her now. Yeah. So there's a part of that that's just like the resistance that poor people get to have of like, I'm not going to keep giving my body over to systems that do not care about me. I'm not going to give the bodies of the people I care about to these systems, Fuck you. Right. I'm going to take her into the backyard and do this myself. And then I think there's the labor of it. It's very much Dune setting off on an individualistic path. And, I hope that readers see throughout the whole time that there's all these places where it's like, Dune probably needs more people around her right now, but she keeps turning in towards herself. And what happens when you keep turning in towards yourself, And this is that first big move where it's like, what would that ceremony have looked like if she had invited her community members into it with her? What would have happened if she had let movement hold her in that moment? And she's not ready to do that yet. But it's also why it's the first novella in a trilogy, because this is a long arc. I think it's a long arc to move from that individualist path to something more collective.
That was actually something I wanted to ask you about, because I think that's a huge dynamic in the book, this like going like between isolation and community, and the conflicting desires that one can have around that. And like, so Dune for much of the book is isolated in her grief, but I think in addition to the family members that she's mourning, she's grieving that community that she doesn't feel like she can take a part in, or is like there's some obstacle for her, even though she was like kind of born into it in a way, because her parents and her grandparents were like part of this community work. Yeah. So I wonder, like, I mean, this I think also connects to the illness and the theories behind the illness in the book around like grievers. Like, what do you think the relationship is between grief and like an attempt to recover this like intergenerational sense of struggle? Is there like a need to do it personal work to be able to get to the community? Does it prepare us for community?
Well, one thing I wanted to interrogate was, I know a lot of people in movement who have kids. And I know a lot of people who are like, oh, because my parents were movement people, I wanted to do something different. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people, even if they end up coming back into movement, there's a part of them that's like, I need to go somewhere else, which is that there's a natural rebellion, that natural like differentiation from your parents, right? So part of it was I wanted to write that's like, you can be steeped in it, and then your rebellion is to go the other way. And so in some ways, Dune's rebellion is to be this introverted, kind of isolated character who comes from hyper extroverted, deeply interconnected people. Right. And that she's never quite felt that connection to, that space to get to be her authentic self, which was also a place, there's a critique of movement inside of that movement can have a very prescriptive way that you have to be in order to be accepted in it. And if you don't fit in, I see people doing this contortion all the time to try to be like, how do I fit in and belong here? And I want movement to be the kind of space that sees itself all the movements, that are concurrent, to be spaces that see themselves as sanctuaries for people to come and be however we are moving towards justice. And instead, I think it can become this like narrow path. Like, if you're like this, you're going to get to justice. It just becomes heaven.
Yeah.
It's like, if you just do all these little rules, you're going to get to the utopian end game. And otherwise, you're canceled, or something else is going to happen to you. Right. So I wanted to give permission to Dune to go about this in her own way. And then I wanted to be in an exploration of like, how do you authentically awaken the desire in someone for community? And then how do you authentically meet that desire with community that can actually nourish what the spirit needs?
And I guess going like in a way, that moment with Eloise is sort of like a crossroads for that. But the conflict, like one of the main conflicts of the book, is that everyone that is surrounding is getting stricken by this illness.
Yes.
And thinking like about that still on the, I guess on the idea of grief, like one of the theories that is in the book, because there's not an explanation necessarily of what's happening, but it's only afflicting Black people in Detroit.
Yes.
And one of the theories is like that the illness is some kind of accumulation of grief, like mourning the movements. And I was thinking about our last conversation where you were talking about, we haven't fully grieved the effects of COINTELPRO on the Black freedom movements.
Exactly.
So yeah, I guess like, what are you trying to capture about Black grief in this book and the contradictions that because Dune experiences contradictions, also being like interracial. And what do you hope to convey about the experience of intergenerational Black movement work through that affect of grief as like the main one?
Yes. That's a great question, Scott. I mean, for me, I think there was something I am interrogating around Blackness in general, which is there's this expectation that we will persist and keep trying and keep living and keep creating culture and joy and magic without an acknowledgement of how much oppression, how much trauma, how much torture, how much death, how much accumulated conditions are still impacting us, right? So there's never a moment of, wow, that was horrific what happened to y'all, and like reparations,
Right.
Wow, this should not happen, like abolition, like it's never a clear, just like, no people should have to live through this level of police killings. Seeing the data, we recognize we need to change our ways.
Right.
It never happens like that. So what happens is we're constantly in pandemic conditions, combined pandemic conditions, depending on where you sit inside of Blackness, plus your economic status, plus your educational status, plus these other things. So, when I was living in Detroit, when I started writing this back in 2011. And what I was seeing was the city had come through, was just towards the end of this massive economic crisis. We were heading into the emergency manager period. And there was just this idea of like, how much can you try to humiliate a Black city and act like Black people don't know how to govern or how to manage our own budget and finances and our water, and just the insult of how people respond to Black leadership and the inability to give any space for learning, right? It's like we're supposed to go from having no access to power to sitting in those positions of power and doing it perfectly without that space in between to necessarily get to practice. What does it look like to govern in different ways? So there's a grief, there's shame, there's rage, and all of that is accumulating in the Black body. And it shows up as early death. And what I was noticing around me was I was like, the Black people in my life don't live as long. And the deaths tend to be so unnecessary and so tragic and so often born of exhaustion, right? That it's like things that might happen to other bodies, but we don't have the spiritual immune system to respond to it because of how much we're carrying. So I wanted to write about that. And in particularly Detroit, I've had a lot of people say they see their city in this book as well. Folks are like, there's a lot of Black cities in this because there are so many similarities of what it means to be a Black city in this period of history. But I wanted to spend some time there, and I wanted to feel my way into it and feel into like, what does it look like to pay a debt of grief? You know, is it possible? Is it possible? And in this book, at least the initial answer is like, even trying to begin to turn towards it, it overwhelms. It's that much. And I think that a lot of us feel that way, that it's like, if I actually stopped to let myself feel everything that me and my people are going through on a daily basis, I would not be able to go on. Like, there's that feeling is always right there on, you know, like just there. And it's like, you got to just push forward, because if you look back, you're going to get sucked into that. So I also wanted to say, to name that and see if we can still find something compelling to help us move forward.
The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
Silver Threads, Still Walking, Still Waking is co-hosted by me, Carla Bergman.
And me, Eleanor Goldfield. This is where we interview long-term organizers and radicals about their watershed moments, what they've learned along the way, and how they maintain their hope on this path, dreaming and building emergent worlds for a present and future anchored in justice and freedom for all.
Because there are forks in the road, but they all lead us home, to the fight, to the build.
Inside my heart is a burning flame. The heat will rise from buried names. Raise the floodlights. The tides will change, the truth shall flow. The river surge and I will show. Raise the floodlights.
Hi, you're listening to The Final Straw Radio. This is my conversation with Adrienne Maree Brown, author of Grievers, a speculative fiction novella just published by AK Press.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I totally, I'm hearing you on that idea of like, if you stopped and let it catch up with you. I mean, in a way, like, I feel like that kind of, that's still an internalization of that kind of like need to be productive and a kind of individualized feeling that doesn't actually reflect on the way that, like, you know, this kind of pain and death happen to individual bodies, but it's the effect of like a larger social war that's going on, and that's creating the conditions that in which people perish.
I mean, this is part of it too, is I know you can't compare pains. I deeply believe that. I have met so many people. I know people from every kind of possible background. And what I know is that the human experience is mostly aligned and similar. Like, mostly we are struggling to belong. We want to feel safe. We want to feel dignified. We get hurt. We're trying to recover, like, for everybody of any background. And so then inside these constructs that get set up, it's like the whole idea of these constructs is to divide us from having these common human experiences, so that some of us can be manipulated, can be oppressed, can be overused, right? So that we can produce what others need. And there's, for me, that the tenderness when you recognize that it's like, just by being born as a Black person, there is nothing about me that is necessarily distinct from the human experience. Every human is miraculous and has the capacity for all the same magics. It's all there. But because of this construct that someone came up with, which again, the story, the power of story, someone came up with a story of superiority. And because of this story, an unimaginable and too heavy amount of trauma has been allowed and enacted upon my lineage.
Yeah.
And then, you know, right now is this interesting moment where Black people are looking at each other like, okay, our lives matter. We're going to raise the bar. We're going to hold this standard. And it becomes necessary then to interrogate, well, what is Blackness inside of this? Black matters, right? If our lives matter, do we mean everybody Black, monolithic Blackness? And we started to really have to name, like, we mean Black trans people. We mean Black disabled people. We mean Black queer people. We mean Black homeless people. We mean Black people with HIV and AIDS. Like, we mean Black incarcerated people. Like, we're really talking about all the people who have experienced the brunt of this weight, right? Those intersectional Blacknesses that were like, those are the lives that we want to center and uplift inside of this mattering. And that's where we see that human. So even those kind of conversations, right? There are people who are like, well, I'm not even there yet.
Yeah.
we're in a really interesting moment, I think, inside of Blackness, where it's like, one of the things Octavia Butler, I think, always did brilliantly was say a Black story is a human story. If I'm telling you a Black story, you, no matter who you are, you should be able to relate to it because it is also a human story. And I think we're in that moment on a grand scale. Is like the story of what's happening with Black people, not just in the US, but globally. The story of what's happening with Black people is the human story right now. And it's not the only human story. The story of what's happening with immigrants is the human story right now. The story of what's happening with incarcerated peoples is the human story right now. And what we have to constantly be able to do is recognize our humanity is never, ever actually separate from those that we are trained to see as lesser than us. That's where the path has gone astray, and that's where we have to figure out how do we return ourselves to ourselves.
Yeah, that quotation from Octavia Butler like also makes me think about what I love so much about her work is how complex the worlds and like the situations and conflicts and the emotions, like nothing's straightforward. It's always kind of ambiguous or ambivalent in ways. And it made me think also about like James Baldwin and Everybody's Protest novel, right? Like he's like, the novel isn't here just to like send a message of Black politics. It's to like render the complexities of experience. And so in your book, like there's this like tension between like, is this like a Black illness, which like in a way kind of, I think like makes Blackness this like simple thing, but like what the illness is that kind of accumulation of grief through the stories and the history that goes back to the way that you're kind of parsing Black Lives Matter, to not be the monolithic, like we know what we mean when we say Black, but like that it's this kind of it's this weight of it, and it's this history, and it's all of these intersections.
Exactly. I mean, it feels important to me to note that, like, I know a ton of Black people who've never been stopped by the police. I know a ton of Black people who've never been arrested. I know a ton of Black people who mostly have not even felt that personally endangered by the police. But when they start to pay attention to those numbers, then they have to interrogate, okay, where in my own Black experience am I tied to that and disconnected from that? And what made that the case? Oh, it's because, I have a friend who's like, I went to an all-white high school, and I went, I from there kind of moved on to a path where I was mostly socialized inside of white spaces. And so I experienced microaggressive racism, but I never experienced that overt institutional racism until it was later systematic, right?
Yeah.
And so I was like, it opens up the idea that there's so much complexity happening within the Black experience right now, today. And that's why Black people run the entire gamut of politics, right? That you have your Black anarchists and you have your Black Republicans, and it's like everyone's having these human experiences and trying to figure out, how do I relate to these constructs? And I think it's a really hard thing to want to be free of a construct, and for some people to think, if I deny the construct is there, I'll be free from it.
Yeah.
And for other people to say, we have to actually point at the construct, all of us together, and tear it down for it to not be there. And yet others to be like, that construct is permanent.
Right.
Like all of that is happening concurrently. And so I get really curious all the time about that, because I'm like, I can see that ignorance is bliss. I can see there are definitely some Black people who are just like bopping along like, it's fine, it doesn't happen to me,
right.
Whatever. And I'm like, maybe it feels good inside of that. For me, when I'm denying something that is true, when I'm denying pain that is actually happening to myself or others, it actually causes me more suffering, because it's not just the pain, but the effort to hold it down, or the effort to keep it locked behind a door. Like eventually that effort becomes exhausting. And, so for me, I'm like, let's bring it into the light and see if we can be deconstructionist.
Yeah, what you just said called to mind, and Joy James kind of tries to distinguish between threads of Black feminism and being like, there's liberal Black feminism, there's even like conservative, and then there's radical revolutionary. And she says like Black women in the position that they're like placed in our society in the US are seen as like default radical, even just like speaking up against racism, which doesn't need to have a radical perspective to be like, that's wrong. That's placed into
right.
this like oh my God, that's like a outrageous thing to say.
Yeah.
But so I was just thinking about how there's all these different like ways to relate to this, and I guess to make this into a question, like what the other thing I was thinking about is so like how do we think about, because you're writing this within the history of Black movements and other kind of community movements and liberatory movements, like I feel like one interpretation could be that these people who succumb to this illness are failures in some way, but I don't think that's the story you're telling in the book. They're not, right? But it's also not like, there's not like a revolutionary response, at least in this volume of the trilogy, right? There's something else happening.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Well, and that, it felt important to me. I will say this, like, I hope that it, as people keep reading the trilogy, I hope that it shows up as a form of discipline. But I was really trying to be like realistic. And what I have experienced every time there's been a massive crisis is that even if people want to move straight to organizing, the part of us that needs to feel happens first. And even just this past couple of years going through COVID processes, you know, it was like there was that first initial like, you know, wave of like, people are actually grieving. People are losing folks. We're really confused. We don't actually know what to do. Let's just follow the CDC, even though we're all, you know, anti-socialist, anti-capitalist, you know, socialist, anarchist people or whatever. We're like, sure, right. Now we'll follow what they say, you know, and feeling myself caught. I mean, like, I wanted to be really humble in some of this, because I was like, I totally got caught up in the like corrective policing behavior of the beginning of this pandemic. I deeply did. And I still feel the vestiges of that. Like I'm like really trying to tease out in myself, like, what is policing and what is protection inside of me? You know, when I am walking out and I see someone without their mask on, and like the part of me that wants to be like, you need to put your mask on. And then quickly this other voice, like, you don't know what that person's situation is. And like, you can't make assumptions, like, you know, and being like, you know, my responsibility is to keep my 6 feet of distance and wear my mask. Like, I am not, you know, what is the collective move that's needed right now? Like, I'm like, all of that still happens. And I've been a radical organizer for 25 years. So I wanted to be in that where I was like, we don't always know what to do, especially when it's happening, when it's overwhelming. And then there are organizers. And I you know, what we see Eloise doing in this book is really holding the position of the organizer. And I wanted people to see that even though Dune is on this individual path of her grief, organizing is still happening. People are being like, we need to figure out the response here. And one of the things that I love about Eloise is she's like, we have to resist, but I don't even know what way we need to resist yet. And I think that happens to us a lot, where we're like, we know this isn't right, but we haven't quite figured out which way we need to go. Yeah. And we get caught in the tension. And, you know, where my emergent strategy brain comes into this is I think we need to be more open to the idea that we're going to run multiple experiments concurrently. Yeah. And so in a way, to me, the book is that, you know, it's like there's multiple things concurrently happening, and we get to see Dune's experience up close, but there's also other experiments going on. Right.
Yeah. And interesting to relate it also to like COVID. Because, like, yeah, initially when COVID happened, and then I was like, oh my God, these contradictions of, like, what we're supposed to do and not supposed to do are going to hit everyone, and we'll, like, all rise up and, like, do a general rent strike, and, like, and then, like, that didn't happen.
Oh, for sure.
But then the George Floyd uprising.
I thought we were going to be so clear. Yeah, I was like, we're definitely, like, eviction moratoriums and rent strike and, like, the whole thing. Yeah. And it was like, we're not. But Minnesota turned the fuck right. And they were like, oh, well, we're just going to take to the streets and y'all going to catch up.
Yeah. And I think that, like, that's related. Like, I think the condition, also the fact that, like, what's happened in Minneapolis wasn't isolated to Minneapolis, but, like, spread across the country, across the globe, was in relation to the pandemic, and the work that people were doing that isn't as visible as, like, a riot, but, like, the kind of mutual aid care work that people were doing in the immediate, like, effects of COVID and having to figure out how to survive when you're abandoned.
Right. And also the analytical work that people are doing all the time. You know, I think that when something happens, you know, like when something like COVID happens, if we don't have an analysis, then it can feel like an isolated event, or we can be like, we don't know why this is spreading the way it's spreading and hitting certain communities the way it is. We don't understand, why these variants are emerging or anything. And I think it's when you're steeped in organizing, then you're like, well, I do have a sense of why. And actually, it is deeply tied back to what's happening to George Floyd.
Yeah.
This, so being able to make that connection of like, if you don't care about the life of poor people, and you don't care about the life of Black people, and you don't care about the life of Indigenous people and immigrant people, if you don't care about the life of people who have disabilities or people who are struggling with the system, struggling with substances, if you dehumanize those people, then when something like COVID happens, that same pathway of thinking, is just going to burn it all down. And now, we're in such an interesting place. And I think Grievers and the real world are very aligned in that way, that we've lost a huge portion of people. And there's this, how do I still be normal? This, now do we function? Now do we go back to normal?
Right.
And it's a little bit more pronounced, I think, in Grievers, that normal is not available in the way that we currently seem to think it is. But in terms of the actual impacts, it's just as unavailable to us now, right?
Yeah.
Like what's happening right now is just like people who try to go about things as normal die.
Yeah.
And then, then you sort of move back into a boundary and then repeat the cycle, right? And because we don't have any strong enough leadership to be like, actually, we're going to change the rules so that we can actually survive this a different way. We don't have that kind of leadership.
I mean, yeah, it's like the negative side of running multiple experiments. Like where I live, the school board just decided to lift the mask mandate in the elementary schools. But
I'm so
I know, and I got a kid in there, and but the people in the school are like preparing for a spike, obviously, because they're like, this is unsafe, Yeah. And so there's everyone has a hand in this, and no one's actually on the same page. It's just, yeah.
Well, and I think this is the interesting thing, right? Is part of, from a scientific perspective, like you run the experiments so that you can reach some conclusion. You gather the data and then you apply that data.
Yeah.
Right? And what I think has happened is we can see the multiple experience happening around the globe. So, my friend Sonia Renee Taylor is down in New Zealand. And so I've been watching how New Zealand is navigating this experiment versus how the US is. In New Zealand, they're like, we got a case, quarantine everyone.
Yeah.
And we're going to track what unfolds down to they're like, we found out exactly the moment that these 2 doors were open in a hospital and the Delta variant was able to move between the rooms. And that's how this person got infected. Right. I mean, that's something unimaginable here,
right,
that we would be tracking and be self-responsive and be able to say we're shutting everything down for 3 weeks until we have contained this and so on and so forth. So even at that level, we do have the multiple experiments happening, but we as the US is very locked in, we're not going to learn from anyone else's experiment.
Right.
And we will not let new data change our position, which is a very American way, right? It's there's really a commitment to I'm going to put what I believe over any new incoming information. And because superiority makes you think that can create a different kind of reality. And I mean, I don't know if you've been following, but I can't look away from these stories of people who were hardcore COVID deniers and hardcore anti-vaxxers who are dying now.
Yeah.
And I just keep reading these stories and feeling in myself the complexity of emotions that get generated in that, right? Because I'm like, you are loved by people. There's people who care about you. And in some cases, it's like the people were like, we were fighting with them till the very end, and they just refused to get help. They refused. And I find myself really mystified. I really want to understand. And, as someone who's in this novel writing journey, I'm like, I really want to understand what it is in our human nature that allows us to create and maintain conditions of illogical danger.
That actually I hadn't thought about this before, but so a novel I really love is Ishmael Reed's Mumbo Jumbo, which is also about a pandemic that is about Black cultural crossover into white culture. And the way that Ishmael Reed talks about, Western culture as a whole there is it's a death cult. It's a death cult, like with a propulsion to kill everyone in the end. Even the white people who are like helming it, right?
Yeah, I mean, there is something, you know, I've written about this in a number of ways, but I think that there is something, again, if you feel truly disconnected from spirit, like if you're like, I'm not connected to something that's larger than myself, I can't feel it, right? Because I'm like, I feel my connectedness to aliveness so viscerally that nothing can take it from me. I'm like, I don't have to, there's no argument to it. It's like, it's so clear in me. And it's taken a lot of work to uncover that and get into it and like trust it, but it's there. And I think there's a lot of people who don't feel that. And in the not feeling of that, I think the terror is so absolute that it's like you have to almost disconnect from from any desire to continue living.
Yeah.
And I think that death cult piece, I think there is a grand scale collective suicidality that is at play and has been. And I don't think it's always been that way, which is always important for me to remember. That I'm like, this is not our human nature, because there were many, 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 many experiments in humans that have not moved towards death or towards war, towards violence, towards guns, towards domination. There's all these other experiments, but how do those experiments actually survive the onslaught of those who are really obsessed with moving towards death and moving, you know, because in some ways it's like if you're trying to move towards power over, you're ultimately constantly moving towards death, because you have to always be in a position of defending that power or having that power taken from you in a violent way. And to me, that's the invitation of power is like, you can be in a power that is not fatal with other people, right?
Yeah.
And I'm cultivating that landscape in Grievers. I'm really, for me, it's like I need, you know, my thing for myself. I don't know if you've read Steve Biko's I Write What I Like, but it's a memoir, political memoir of a South African anti-apartheid organizer that I love. But I write what I need.
Yeah.
I write what I need. And I feel like sometimes I like what comes out. A lot of times I'm just like, well, it's true or it's honest. It's true to me.
Yeah.
And what I feel like right now is I'm like, I need to write something that helps me see a compelling way out of this time.
Yeah.
Because it's breaking my heart. So I'm writing from that place.
I mean, I feel it in the book too. Just in it's like, you know, you talking about like wanting it to be realistic, and like you render the world in it like really beautifully and richly. And I love some of the kind of striking combinations of like adjectives and stuff. Like there's this one thing that I just pulled out was the calm waves sweeping Dune's parents away, like that, like thinking about it as a calm wave, but like the motion. And like, I think that's interesting to juxtapose with like the kind of speculative aspect of it, that it's like, it's really physical, palpable, embodied, and also connected to the seasons really strongly in a way that's maybe counterintuitive too, because like the hardest time in a way is like summer, and then winter's where she's like kind of reaching out to people. So I don't know. I mean, do you have thoughts about like the way that we're trying to render like that kind of physical embodied experience like in a novel and yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, I really wanted to pay homage to Detroit as a location and like what it feels like to move through the year there and what it takes to survive a winter in Detroit. And you know, it's so cold and it can get so isolating and you just need people so much. And I have such sweet memories of discovering how to stay warm inside of a cold place, and then sweet memories of what spring feels like after a Detroit winter, which is incredible and enlivening, and then summer. And I also wanted to capture the fact that like the places that are rotting, the places that are not being tended to, like the summer can be a really dangerous and fatal time. And so, you know, that's what's happening in this book is like, which I think we've been learning a lot about the seasonal aspect with COVID too. It's been interesting. It's just like, actually the winter is so dangerous. And the summer actually gives us more space. And so I wanted it to feel for people like, no matter when they read it, that it can feel current, that it can feel like they can feel themselves in that world and in that particular Detroit. And I want, this is my book of grief too. So it's a grief of a certain time and place in Detroit, a certain set of people. So I also wanted to bring it to life forever, like, or as long as the book exists, I wanted it to be like, if you need to go be in that Detroit where Grace Lee Boggs was alive and Charity Hicks was alive and Shetty was moving around and David Blair was spitting poetry. And if you need to visit that Detroit, it's still here in these pages. And I hope other people also will write about that time and place and people. But this was my offer.
Yeah. I mean, I want to actually pick up a little bit more on Detroit because, I mean, you said like people reacted to the book saying like, oh, this could have been my city. But in a way, that I felt this is like very much a Detroit novel. And I just read a book, a novelization of the riots in '67 too, and thinking like back then, the abandonment that's like so commonly known about Detroit was like happening so long ago, right? It wasn't just like in the 80s or whatever. Like it was like that in the 60s.
And it's moved in waves and waves and waves. Part of it is like it's a river city and things are always moving through that city. And Detroit is a place where people have survived for such a long time in the absence of what we would quote unquote call success or being a successful city. And it's one of the reasons I think Grace Lee Boggs said that Detroit is what the rest of the country has to look forward to, because it's like every city goes through these cycles in different ways. Some cities never recover from them and we forget the names, and other places continuously recover. Detroit feels particularly unique in its not going to give upness, because there's been many moments where it's like, okay, I think that might be it. But then organizers generally keep it going, and people who wouldn't call themselves organizers. One of my favorite things when I was living there was I would meet people who were doing all the work of organizing, and they would be like, I'm not an organizer. I'm a community member. I live in this community. And so I'm doing this. And I think it was that spirit in that location, I think unlocks something about persistence that I want people to know about and think about and consider. I also think it's like a vortex city, like Sedona, Arizona has that like spiritual vortex around it. I think there's something similar happening in Detroit. And I want people to consider that there's a reason why it doesn't disappear, and there's something karmically that the city is moving through and learning about its true value, which I think is in its collectivism and in its fecundity. It's in the proximity to the water. It's in the blackness that has moved up from the south, up the Underground Railroad. I think it's a sacred place. I know we're at time, but I also want to say to people, I hope that the book invites people to read a lot more from Detroiters and about the city. Of course, I'm a student of Grace Lee Boggs, and, her autobiography, Living for Change, is a beautiful piece of work. But James Boggs, who was her partner and an incredible labor organizer, has a ton of writing, an American revolutionary. There's so much good content that's come out. And then there's people who are living and writing and thinking and creating around the city now. So I hope that it's an invitation to people to get curious about what is coming from Detroit. Yeah,
I felt like, you really feel the space and the place and the relationship to the history and the people there, and like a knowledge of how people live and survive. So I think, thanks for also, extending that to the larger canon of Detroit literature. Well, thank you. So I know, I could talk to you about lots of different things for much longer, I'm sure, but I want to, keep this succinct. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh, I always love our conversations, Scott.
Yeah.
I really do. I appreciate you inviting me on, and I hope they're of use to the listeners.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to the next volume of the trilogy.
Yeah.
All right. You. Thanks so much.
And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We'll call like a
For some context, I record this in the wake of the verdict of the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, and before any verdict rendered in the trial of the 3 white men in Georgia who hunted and killed Ahmaud Arbery. That verdict at this recording is still pending. Now, some background. Kyle Rittenhouse was 17. He took an AR-15 rifle across state lines to maintain order in Kenosha after police shot an unarmed black man there and protests ensued. In Kenosha, Rittenhouse killed 2 unarmed protesters and seriously injured a third. He won a trial claiming self-defense and was acquitted of all criminal charges. I believe that the Kyle Rittenhouse acquittal signals a new era in American political discourse, a dangerous one where automatic rifle fire will be a substitute for nouns and verbs. But before I get to that, some observations. I was 17 once. I remember being 17. I was an idiot. I didn't always make the best choices. It's an age where we think we're the center of the universe, the protagonist of the movie. So I imagine a Kyle Rittenhouse, a 17-year-old kid, as dumb as I was when I was 17, and that he's watching some TV footage of riots, perhaps imagining himself some kind of protagonist savior who would be greeted with ticker tape parades when he showed up to stop the looting and chaos, who believed himself to be the good guy, the hero of his story, like many American stories where the hero is a white guy with a gun. Those stories are pretty pervasive. Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, Lewis and Clark, Dirty Harry, Lethal Weapon. You get the picture. So what I think we have is a stupid 17-year-old making a series of stupid decisions. Not to defend him or take his side, but I would suggest that he probably meant well, intended to serve the forces of good in his own narrow and probably at the very least unconsciously racist worldview, where good and bad were perceived by a 17-year-old's mind. And as a result of these stupid decisions, a 17-year-old with an AR-15 rifle found himself in the middle of a hectic situation that was way over his head, a situation largely of his own creation that was beyond his ability to navigate. And so, in very critical moments, this 17-year-old made catastrophically stupid decisions. One of the problems with being 17 isn't just that you're stupid. It's that you're stupid and don't know it. What I mean is, I'm stupid at 52, but at least I have the life experience that informs me as to the breadth and depth and scope of my own stupidity. Kyle Rittenhouse didn't have that. He was 17 and he was an idiot. Someone not just stupid, but so stupid he didn't know he was stupid. He didn't know what he didn't know. That proved fatal for 2 other people and seriously injurious for a third. I look at Kyle Rittenhouse and I don't see a monster. I see a dumb kid who should have gotten caught by his parents when he tried to pull out of the driveway with a gun in the car, and who should have been grounded and had his cell phone taken away for 2 weeks. But he wasn't caught, and now there's a monstrous outcome. This might not be a popular position, but I don't think of Kyle Rittenhouse as exceptional. We have a country full of Kyle Rittenhouses. I'm reminded that the U.S. is one of the only first world nations that refuses to sign on to the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Child. Do you know why? Because it would force the U.S. to keep military recruiters out of the schools. The U.S. doesn't want to keep its recruiters out of the schools. They want to engage all those stupid 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouses with impulse control problems and dubious uninformed worldviews and highly questionable images of themselves. Recruiters want to show stupid 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouses those flashy videos of guns and bombs, explosions and tanks and planes. In Kenosha, Kyle Rittenhouse killed people with the very rifle you'll see in those recruitment videos. I wonder if he ever saw one of those. I bet he did. We have a country full of him. In fact, the United States is a Kyle Rittenhouse factory. We mass produce them, send them to schools that make them stupid, then put them in uniforms and hand them guns, sending them around the world to kill and die, seemingly because we have a lot of them and can't think of any better use for them. I'm reminded of the really cynical words of a drill sergeant when I was in the Army. He said he joined the Army to travel to distant lands, encounter strange cultures, meet exotic people, and kill them. He meant that to be funny. But I think we know things are only funny because, well, they're true. So looking at this situation, the only thing that makes it exceptional is geography, that it happened in Kenosha rather than in Kabul. One of our Kyle Rittenhouses misfired and went off on his own before anyone gave him a uniform or a badge to make the blood spill official. And so a trial ensued to make the blood spill official ex post facto, presided over by a judge with a Donald Trump theme song ringtone and a Bible that he used for judicial desk reference. The end result of the trial was predictable and somewhat irrelevant. It wouldn't do anyone any good to toss one Kyle Rittenhouse in prison while thousands more are running around shooting up the whole planet. To make a difference, you'd have to lock up their manufacturers and those who fund their excursions, the U.S. Congress. You'd have to lock up the ringleaders who deploy all of them, presidents and governors and chiefs of police. We're not going to do that. We don't have the bed space for that. So instead, we now have a world where people can bring firearms into a public situation and then justify the subsequent slaughter of unarmed people they commit by asserting fear that someone unarmed may have taken the shooter's gun if they weren't killed. We're talking about the militarization and weaponization of public space, a world where everyone must arrive armed or be perceived as a threat by virtue of being unarmed. The irony is that an unarmed protester is now the greater perceived threat, at least in the legal litmus of mass shooter self-defense claims, because mass shooters don't fear the armed protester will overpower and take a mass shooter's guns. So, the only way for you to avoid getting killed and then getting blamed for it by the mass shooter who killed you is to show up with your own guns. I think that will be the one lasting legacy of this trial. Anyone who wants to live will, from now on, either cede the public space to the right-wing gun nuts or else show up with guns, knowing that everyone else is showing up with guns. Gone are the days when social and political disputes will be argued with words or fists. The First Amendment just became the Second Amendment. The official language of the United States isn't English, it's gunfire. Better get fluent. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from the Super Duper Uber Mega Ultra Hyper Turbo Multi Maxi Max in Youngstown, Ohio. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can write to Sean Swain at his new old new again address at Sean Swain, number A243205, OSP Youngstown, 878 Coatesville Hubbard Road, Youngstown, Ohio 44505. If you'd like to see some of his writings, check out easy ways to get a hold of his books, or make donations to his legal support, you can visit seanswain.org. This is The Final Straw. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned co-op in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events up at their website, firestorm.coop.
The fires that really devastated this community happened between late 1997, then 1999. In that period of time, they probably had at least 500 or 600 fires down here, and I lived through that. When there was a fire, I would make one call, and it would ring all the way around the community. Is it you? Are you all right? Whatever, and then it would come back to my house. We had one of the most beautiful communities when I moved here that you can imagine.
Condos were out on my old turf. For what it's worth, soul got left in the earth. On a search, I stood in front of Compton where the Hudson building spoke first and said, I was here. Old bricks all over downtown, the Sears with the roebuck attachment. Purple gang used to move to your block like a mafia pageant. Move around in my town with spitters talk. And if you leave, forget us and try to come back, I hope you turn into a pillar of salt. Ajax came and cracking the concrete. That's a lost and forgotten piece of the deep. We'll never see in the book of paper replaced with a 10th casino, strip mall, liquor store, another stadium, doubling as a palladium eateries. Speaks to me. Now watch yesterday get swept away beneath a pile of debris. Committees picking from a lottery for the hottest riverfront property. Sign over your deeds, shocking to see us go from people mover to people mover. Let the people choose a better way. They set up shop and sped away. Landmarks come and go like a John with a pro. Let it straight and they run up on the trade for consumption. So I look back, see my city under construction. I look back, see my city under construction. With the locusts
surrounded, suffocating my city and trying to ravaging the crops, making the situation. But we staying, never let the locusts approach us. Locusts and buzzers circle and hover above the abandoned houses, shattered windows with the crooked shutter. Cross the street, construct a cookie cutter condominium. Line of Woodward is the prime meridian. You divide the city, and in the hood, wonder why you pay 2 times the premium. They've been redlining the dark skin. Owners of homes where they loan with a shark's fin. Arson of property, probably for their insurance policy. It's a prophecy that's self-fulfilling. They claim to cure us of poverty, but it's serving removal of residents for urban renewal. The reverend is the realtor here to save and heal ya. They even buy ugly houses, and it's memorabilia of a myth of a city that's a mystery. Auto industry's widow. On the auction floor, they start to bid low on houses with hanging gutters and peeling shingles. Purchased at a nervous pace and a cadence. I heard a wrecking ball hit a building that's mistaken for vacant. A sleeping city awakened by bulldozers, and the wool pulled over our eyes. It comes as no surprise. Why to rent some more from the French to Ford to the Illiches, trying to pillage the village and milk it for all that it's worth. While they killing us, but we still got resilience against the locusts.
Surrounding, suffocating my city and trying to
choke us,
ravaging the crop, making the situation
hopeless.
But we staying
focused,
never let the locusts approach us.
So the issues of racism, classism in terms of moving out of the city and leaving it desolate was a very, very intentional kind of thing. And now folks can come back, get the land, get the buildings and stuff for virtually nothing and make huge profits.
Selective memory, convenient amnesia. Enemies scheming on land seizures. Pretend to be well-meaning but stampede us. I know you're not supposed to bite the hand that feeds ya, but it's poisonous, spreading justice like fungus candida. Predatory planning, eminent domain. Mow down Motown for a parking lot next to the game. Empty sentiment of development for pennies to gain. Forget memory lane, this is history. It's like erasing proof, only remembering Eminem's name. Many stories, only one written and pen will remain. With jobs, we at least in a drought. Met a construction worker, hates demolishing buildings, but gotta feed the seeds and the sprouts. Told me the city pushes people into leaving their house. They cut the lights and gas, it freezes them out. Who decided the divide between suburb and ghetto corner? Henry Ford swinging his chain, Nazi medal of honor.
Hey, this is where Paradise Valley was. Hey, what about where Hastings was? Hey, what about Black Bottom? And see, the thing is that all of this was connected, but when that freeway went through, people started getting disconnected.
I'm looking at this strip with Lottie the body, she probably shook them hips. The malnourished, the wild flourish among style murderers who wanna pound dirt on us. The word on the street is that we won't last long. And is it me? But if the history of my city was passed on, could we physically and spirit and mind find a way to move and grab at this song? And I was young but snuck in mahogany for stars in orbit. Unsupported foundation, we aborted sound, the loud rape, but now it's a bar where men and women get the frequent spit a slick thing in each other's ear. Sip a mix, drinking beer for sport, not a block and not here. And how we got here, we never know. Shoulder broken up hip-hop shop board on VH1. Like, hey, come in, come see where they from. And that shit was too hard for me to chew like I hate gum. And y'all can play dumb like Jim, man. All I want is another lush lounge for us. And new united sounds around the bus. People can see us before the debris and dust and what was. And I am not trying to rap, man. I'm time traveling.
The ideal city is where the residents have an input in the development, and they know they feel they have an input in the development, and they benefit from the development. And when you have development like that, the spirit of the development is good.